On today's show, potential outcomes in the 25-26 season.
Your Locked On Capitals, your daily podcast on the Washington Capitals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Well, hello and welcome into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Dan Holme. I've covered the Capitals for the past 3 seasons for Locked On and various other outlets before that. I'm also the host of the weekly show called The Capitals Minute Cast, available wherever you find your podcasts. And as always, I want to thank you for making this your first listen of the day. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. Download the FanDuel app now by visiting FanDuel.com and win $300 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. So in this edition of Locked On Capitals, we talk about the latest with number 74, John Carlson. Listen, we know that the Capitals have been non-committal on John Carlson, and John Carlson himself has been non-committal with his future with the Capitals. What's the latest? A bit later, we'll talk about Garen Bjorklund. An intriguing storyline to follow as Clay Stevenson, if he does not make the Capitals roster, has to face the waiver wire. There is a distinct possibility he gets scooped up by another team, and that means Garen Bjorklund is the number 1 in Hershey. We'll talk about that, but just to get it going here, talking about potential outcomes in the 2025-2026 season. And a lot hinges on the veterans on this team. Do they take steps forward? Do they help lift the younger players that are on this team? But to be clear here, it's not fair for them to carry the load for the entire team. The young players on this team are going to have to carry their weight as well. So let's talk about that, potential scenarios and outcomes in the 2025-2026 season. And I'd say right off the bat, there is a wide range of possibilities. On one end, you have high-end projections. Some outlets are saying 107-point season, so 107. And I think it's doable, right? I mean, the Capitals put up, 111 last season? And we don't know if they're going to be as good as last year, but I'm not going to sell them short because we remember last year, people didn't think the Capitals were going to make it to the playoffs, period. Far out exceeding everyone's expectations. So I don't want to sell them short. I definitely think that's a possibility, and that's not nothing. That is not a pipe dream. That's if everything goes right. And it's like I said, the veterans on this team. Does Dubois continue to dominate at the second line position, at the second line center position? And Tom Wilson plays with a physical edge, but, it's not just about physicality. If he can put up, let's say, 25 goals, that would go a long ways. And the man himself, Alex Ovechkin, the captain of the team, what to expect from him being 40 years old, 21st season in the league? Can he put up, say, 35 or 40 goals? And then most importantly, the young guys don't just skate. They impact games. Who's that going to be? Is it going to be Leonard, Crystal? Is it going to be Milano, Hendrix Lapierre? The players that are chosen need to carry their weight. And I know the Capitals making it to the playoffs, let's say 107 points, a dream scenario, right? But hockey seasons don't play out like video game simulations. It's not about like you're picking your fantasy team. It's reality. The team is going to be battling. We know that. Battling for a playoff spot, as a lot of the teams in the Metro got markedly better. And the Capitals were fairly quiet during the offseason, save sort of in Declan Chisholm. And the inevitable ebbs and flows, battling through injuries and trying to get scoring depth night to night. That on paper, this team looks good. And what we have seen in the preseason with the youth is encouraging. But is that going to duplicate into the 25-26 season? And, remember last season, how many games came down to whether the second and third lines showed up? And one of the things that we're hoping for this season is that the third line is not the weakness for the Capitals yet again. We remember last year, it was the biggest glaring weakness on the team. They brought in Lars Eller to try to solidify that third line at the center position, as we know that he is on to his next destination. On paper, really early, it could be Connor McMichael, it could be Hendrix Lapierre at the center position, and then building around it, say a Sonny Milano, something like that, that it definitely could take a step forward. And, you need more than just guys like Alex Ovechkin and Strome on that first line to win the Metro. The NHL is not built like that anymore. You can't just have one solid line. And I don't think the Capitals do, but what I'm saying here is that it can't just be the Ovi show, because it very well could be Ovechkin's last season in the NHL. But speaking about the big man, has missed a substantial amount of time in practice. We saw him involved in the last practice in contact. So it is encouraging that he will be good to go. And, kind of a collective sigh of relief across Caps land to see him involved, practicing with the big group, taking contact, and the update is positive. Spencer Carberry said Ovechkin is expected to be ready by the opener on October 8th. But with that said, what kind of Alex Ovechkin are we going to see, given the fact that he has not had as much preseason reps as the other players? But having him in the mix, whatever condition, is huge. But the thing is, it's bigger than that. There is the bigger picture with Ovechkin. We know that he accomplished the big thing last season, catching and passing Wayne Gretzky. But there's more milestones that he's chasing down in what could very well be his last season. But, at 40, the usage has to be managed. We're not going to see the same Ovechkin that we've seen from years before. He can still one-time the puck from his office on the power play. He can still be a net front distraction, but you can't lean on him to play 20 minutes every single game. He is that Russian machine that never breaks, but he still is that Russian machine at 40 years old. And the coaching staff is well aware of it. And what we saw last season is that Alex Ovechkin, in a lot of ways, had better production with limited minutes. It kind of flies in the face of logic, right? You think that if you'd be out there, the more minutes, the better, right? But I think that Spencer Carberry and his staff realizes to get the best out of Ovechkin, you have to scale it back a little bit. And then the young talent. That's the other thing, transitioning from the core, right? What I was talking about there, into the next wave, the young group. Ryan Leonard, for one, they're not just watching his goals, they're watching how well he defends. How well can he handle failure? How well does he handle battles on the wall? And how well does he handle himself against grown men in the league? One of the things that, Ryan Leonard said by his own admission, as he's struggled, as the defenders in the National Hockey League are markedly bigger and stronger than they are in college. And that's all things for him to consider. And we have seen him come in this season bulked up a bit. And that's what the Caps coaching staff is going to hammer home. Because if Leonard can give you a trustworthy, say 12 to 14 minutes a night, and, Protas, who had a career year last year as well, can he handle heavy board work down low? Suddenly you're looking at a pretty balanced lineup. You're not leaning solely on the veterans, the proven commodities on the team. It doesn't all have to fall on Ovechkin. It doesn't all have to fall on Tom Wilson. And that's just the forwards, right? And I'll talk about John Carlson a bit later, but John Carlson on the blue line and how the blue line looks this season. And I think that Faravari, is, taking his way back slowly. We know that he is still dealing with some inflammation, but once he's 100%, I think that he is going to take the blue line, and take it to the next level, because Martin Faravari, the guy that, was rewarded with a huge contract, they don't just hand those out to anybody, that he is going to be the guy that is going to be one of the faces on the future of the blue line, a big contributor, because we know that, whatever happens with John Carlson, he is not going to be here forever. And he's entering that zone where defensemen usually start to peak. And we saw that from Martin Fehervary last year, take big steps forward until the injury in the latter part of the season. And if he can steady the top pair and also chip in transition with the offense, that'll be huge. This defense won't be flashy, but it will be stable. And that's where the Capitals are at right now. So the long view is here. The Capitals have a chance to be more than what everyone perceives them to be, a bubble team. If health holds, and, the Capitals got pretty lucky last season, save Alex Ovechkin, Chikrin, Roy, missed some time just off the top of my head. But the Capitals, with a broad brush, were pretty healthy last year. And if the veterans, can maybe take a step back a little bit, I'm talking Ovechkin, I'm talking John Carlson, and let the young guys kind of take over the reins. I know it's a difficult thing, but it is a transition that's hard. It's like having your kids and having them moving out of the house and going on to college. It's difficult, but it's the next phase of life. This is the next phase for the Capitals. Veterans still very important, but being able to relinquish the reins, I guess, at least a little bit to the younger players on the team, that will be huge for the Capitals' overall health and their ability to make a deep push into the playoffs in 25-26. All right, so coming up here after the break, we'll talk about the latest surrounding John Carlson and his future with the Capitals. I'll discuss straight ahead. The NFL season is here, and FanDuel has an offer that you don't want to miss. Right now, new customers can bet just $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win. That's right, pick a bet, put down $5, and if it hits, you'll unlock $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. I love how FanDuel gives me so many ways to play. I've built parlays, tried player props, and even followed live lines during the game. It makes watching football even more exciting when you've got a little something riding on the action. And when you're watching on any given Sunday, you're already a fan of the game. If it's the Commanders or say you're a Ravens fan, but say you want vested interest in all of the games, open up the FanDuel app, put a little bit of money on the game. All of a sudden, they got all that much more exciting. So what are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com to download the FanDuel app today to get started. All right, welcome back into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. You can find me on Twitter. It's at DanCaps218. You can find the show on Twitter. It's at Locked On Cap. So in the second segment here, we're talking about a big question surrounding the Capitals. What is the future of John Carlson on the Capitals? We know that he is entering into a contract year, and both sides, Chris Patrick and the Capitals, non-committal, and John Carlson kind of wants to know what direction this team is going in. A big storyline to follow. And, I think it's going to change the blue line in a big way, especially if the Capitals don't have any long-term plans with him and they move on from him. That's going to be a whole lot more responsibility for the younger kids on the team. So let's dive into that in the second segment of the show here, because that is the big story under the surface right now. Carlson entering into the final year of his contract. And you take a look at him, he is paid handsomely, $8 million against the cap, but quality minutes. There is no doubt. The Capitals' blue line is markedly better with number 74 in the mix. And the reports this week says he wants to stay with the Capitals, but he's also made it clear he wants a fair deal. He's not taking a discount, nor should he. He is in the back nine, relatively speaking, of his NHL career. And he's got a family, right? A wife and kids and all that goes along with that. And he's a solid player. He deserves to be paid. However, do the Capitals have long-term plans, or do they plan on transitioning more into the youth? Because here's the thing. We know about John Carlson, and if you're an everydayer and you follow the team, he has been the anchor on the blue line for years. Quarterbacks the power play, logs tough minutes, and still produces offense at a high level. And he's crossed some big milestones just last season. And he's creeping up on the franchise records for defensemen. And when it's all said and done, there is no doubt he will go down as one of the best defenders, not just on the Capitals, but in the NHL. And a guy that, kind of just goes about and does his business, not too flashy, doesn't get involved with a lot of extracurricular activities, will from time to time, just goes out there and executes nearly flawlessly 9 times out of 10. Is he perfect every time he's on the ice? No, but if he's out there, the Capitals have a better chance of winning, is what I'm going to say. And the young players on this team look up to him as an example. And he's one of the top active defensemen in the league in offensive production. So not only do you have a guy that is sound defensively, there's a lot of those kind of guys in the NHL, but a defender that can also contribute in a big way offensively is huge. But where it gets tricky for the Capitals is age. And age is just a number, right? Except if you're a professional athlete. He's turning 36 in January. And that matters when you're talking about dollars surrounding a player. The Capitals want him here, right? And Carlson wants to be here, but it has to make sense for both parties. How that makes sense, that's where it gets a little bit tricky. Let's take a step back. Carlson has been a Capital his whole career. Drafted in the first round back in, 2008? And we all remember the 2010, World Juniors where he scored that OT winner. And not that long after, he's making his mark in DC. Of course, the high water mark for a lot of the Capitals still on the roster is 2018 Stanley Cup run. Carlson was massive. And, it was all a part of the winning formula of 2018. The Capitals winning a Stanley Cup, improbable, I guess is what I'm going to say. I don't think many people projected it even in 2018. But in 2018, he put up 20 points in 24 playoff games, which is insane, for a defenseman. That is the kind of production you only get from an elite blue liner, underline, boldface, elite blue liner. Oftentimes people say, well, he plays a lot of minutes. We'll put someone else in there, right? It's simple. Just put someone else in there. Sure, you're not going to get the same results. John Carlson is, a unique player and has a high level of play most of the time when he's on the ice. And it's not just about the numbers, right, that you could point to his offensive production. It's about reliability. Night after night, Carlson was out there in big moments. And, now that he's getting older, he's still logging top pair minutes. The Capitals brought in Jacob Chikrin. They brought in Matt Roy. They brought in all these different players to, hope, the hope is to alleviate some of that pressure on number 74 so he doesn't have to play so many minutes. Guess what? Still plays a lot of minutes. And that speaks volumes of his conditioning, his preparation, and high hockey IQ to still, edging into being 36 years old, logging top pair minutes, And, you take a look at him, he reads the game differently. Hockey IQ, right? That is something that you hear more and more in the NHL. It's not something that's quantifiable that you're going to see on the back of a hockey card or in advanced analytics, but he understands the game better than a lot of other defenders do. So, when you're talking about legacy of Capitals, the Capitals players from the quote unquote Rock the Red era, he's in that same breath as Ovechkin and Backstrom as pillars of that era. And no, he doesn't have the same name recognition outside DC as Ovi, but I think that if you are an NHL fan kind of on a bigger scale, the name John Carlson. But as Capitals fans, John Carlson is one of the greatest defensemen in Caps history. For that, there is no doubt. And now, how do you handle a player like that at the tail end of his prime? And I'm not trying to say that, this is the back nine and I said back nine, but, relatively speaking, I still think he's going to put up big numbers, but how do you handle a player that has been so huge for the Capitals for a year? Yeah. You take a look at it, just hand him the checkbook, have him fill it out, whatever he wants. It's not that easy. And that's the tough part. You want to respect his body of work and you want him to retire in a Capitals jersey. But you cannot ignore the fact that he is going into being 36 years old. And, salary cap, it's not as easy as just paying guys, based on vibes and what they've meant to this team for years. He's 36. And is he willing to accept what the Capitals are willing to offer? You risk being stuck with a heavy contract that limits the flexibility down the road. Is he going to be a roadblock for, a Vincent Iorio, for example, or a player that's, on their way up, chess league, these kind of guys? If you go too cheap or too short, you risk disrespecting him and then him telling his agent, hey, let's test the open market. I know what I'm worth. I know you're trying to sell me short, that I'm 36 years old. I'm here to tell you I got a lot of fuel left in the tank. And that's honesty, right? I think the sweet spot is the shorter extension, maybe 2 years, maybe 3 tops, at a number that keeps him comfortable but doesn't handcuff the team. We've seen the Capitals do that this last year, where Logan Thompson got a deal. Chikrin got a deal. Dowd, that the Capitals are willing to take care of their players, but also giving them contracts that they're worth at this stage of their career. I like John Carlson, right? But is he going to be willing to accept a lesser deal than honestly he could get somewhere else? But because beyond that, Carlson's mentorship matters. It's the intangibles, right? The fact that he has been in the league, that he has played for so long. And he's helping the young guys along, like Martin Faravari. He is a guiding voice for guys like Vincent Iorio and other young prospects that are developing in Hershey. And, that's a value, like I said, that doesn't show up on a score sheet. And even if his minutes scale back, which I think, is the hope, right? Every year, that's the hope that, we can get John Carlson not playing so many minutes, that he is still a real weapon on the defense. And he's not the guy that, relies on raw speed. And, the NHL has changed. It is a quicker league. But the skills that he has and his skill set matter. That he is entrusted with some big roles, to eat up a lot of minutes, to chip in offensively, to be a mentor for a lot of the younger players, that is something that the Capitals are going to have to compensate him for. I know they don't want to spend a lot of money, and I know that they don't want to give him a tremendous amount of term based on his age. But if they have long-term plans, get a deal done or view trading him. That's a tough part, right? We know what he means to this team, but if the two teams cannot come together, we don't want this to go to the open market where he walks for free. That is the absolute worst case scenario. I'm all about a John Carlson deal, like I said, between a 1 all the way up to, I would say, a 3-year max. And if he's willing to accept that at the dollar figure that the Capitals put up, then there's a future here. If not, the Capitals could get a handsome return. But the Capitals would be smart to do it sooner than later, because if it goes all the way out to the trade deadline, you're not going to get as much for him as, say, you would right now. All right, so coming up here after the break, still controversy in net for the Capitals. I'm talking in Washington and in Hershey. What's the latest? I'll break it all down next. All right, welcome back into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. The best way that you can help grow the show is to subscribe to Locked On Capitals on YouTube and comment anything down below. So in the final segment of today's show, Garen Bjorklund gets assigned or loaned to Hershey. What does that mean for the Capitals? The big elephant in the room, one of the elephant, there's a lot of big elephants in a small room, and we got to get some of these elephants out of here, is what are we going to do with Clay Stevenson, right? He projects, he tracks as an elite level netminder. However, the logjam in net, Logan Thompson, Charlie Lindgren, what do you do? I know what I would do. Put the GM hat on. I've said it before. I would view Charlie Lindgren as a piece for a trade. And I say that because Charlie Lindgren is good. I'm not here to disparage him, but he doesn't track elite at an elite level the same way that I believe Clay Stevenson does. The difficult position, however, is do the Capitals view that the same way, through the same lens? And the fact, and I'm recording this at 5:31 here today on Wednesday, so if something happens between now and the time you hear the podcast, don't at me about it because I can't change the podcast in fluid. I hit record and I shoot it up into the airwaves. Is that Clay Stevenson, they're kind of dragging their feet on it, right? That he is not on the waiver wire yet. And I think they're having a hard time coming to terms with what to do with the whole netminding situation. Garen Bjorklund very well could be the number one netminder in Hershey if someone scoops up Clay Stevenson or say something, the Capitals listen to me, Chris Patrick listens to me and they keep him on the big team. That Garen Bjorklund is an interesting case that, what we saw from him in the preseason game, really good. And if Clay Stevenson is on to the next one, then Garen Bjorklund is the de facto number one. Again, this is a fluid situation. We don't know what's going to happen with Clay Stevenson. I know that a bunch of players got put on the waiver wire. And like I said, at the time of me recording this, he was not on the waiver wire. So the Capitals are having a hard time coming to terms. So that's Clay Stevenson. That's the netminding situation at large. Let's drill down on Garen Bjorklund and where he's at in this whole mix, because he stands to take on a much bigger role in Hershey. I think that he was kind of projected to be the number 2 in Hershey, right? But he very well could be the number 1 as he gets loaned to Hershey. And an interesting story, because he looked good in camp, stopped all 15 shots he faced against Boston. And what we saw with the Stingrays, a stud in the ECHL last year with South Carolina, again, exceeded my expectations. I knew that Bjorklund was good. What we're seeing and what should be very apparent to, everyone that follows the NHL is the Capitals pipeline is jam-packed with great netminders. Now, what has been said is not many of them are elite, right? And I think that Garen Bjorklund is a little bit early to project him as elite, but could be. And an interesting situation as they have another guy that's simmering up in the form of Garen Bjorklund. Because listen, he's going to need to get his reps in. So if he's a backup in Hershey as like a 1B situation or a number 1 and number 2, however you want to look at it, he's going to need to get in his reps, and he'll get that in Hershey. And this also, like I said, ties to Clay Stevenson. If Stevenson clears, then Bjorklund gets a full AHL year to keep building. And if it happens, I think that Hershey is going to be in a good position, however it shakes out. And either way, that's not bad for the organization. Depth is a luxury in net. And we know that all of these netminders that are in the big crock pot that is Hershey, that is, the Stingrays, that they're not all going to be Capitals. They are going to be used as pieces in trades to help bolster this team, right? And right now, the Capitals have that in spades. They have a lot of depth in net. And now as far as, the guys that are on the bubble, they're going to have to prove it. And, when I talk about, Garen Bjorklund, and when I talk about Clay Stevenson, I think that Clay Stevenson very well could be the number 2. It's just the interesting position that the Capitals find themselves in right now is how all in are they on a Clay Stevenson, and what does that mean for Garen Bjorklund? Well, that's what I've talked about in this episode. Is one of the elephants in the room for the Capitals is how to handle the netminding situation. Again, to wrap it up here, I think that, Clay Stevenson very well could be that number 2 in net in Washington. I do believe it. It's getting Chris Patrick to believe the same thing that I believe, because I think that there is a trade partner for Charlie Lindgren. Should have done it, earlier, but it is what it is. I think that Clay Stevenson came out of the gate and surprised everyone. And same goes for Garen Bjorklund, right? That what we saw under the big lights, albeit preseason, he looked really good. I think that changed the perception of the Capitals organization and in Hershey of how great of a netminder Bjorklund was. Like, wow, this guy looks really, really good. I think he could be a starter in the American League right now, and that very well might be the case. a lot of big questions for the Capitals to answer. Again, I just have a strong hunch that the Capitals are, feeling the same dilemma as well. What do we do with Clay? What do we do with Clay? I'm here to tell you, Chris Patrick, if you're listening to this, view options for trading Chucky. Chucky's good. I think that Clay tracks better, elite. And that is ultimately the position that we're at right now. And Garen Bjorklund, listen, could be a starter in the AHL, and his career could just jump to the moon in short order as well. Listen, I want to thank you for joining me on this edition of Locked On Capitals, your only daily year-round podcast covering the Capitals. And I want to thank all of you that listen on the audio side and watch this on YouTube. You are what makes this show successful. When you're done here, head on over to Locked On NHL, as they have you covered 5 days a week, available wherever you find your podcasts and on YouTube. All right, once again, I want to thank you for joining me on this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. It is your team every day. My name is Dan Holney, and I'll talk to you again next time.